To cover verses 20 through 44 this morning. I know it's warm, and I don't know if we're going to get done. I hate to not get done this morning because I won't be here next week. But on the other hand, I don't want to keep everybody, when it's warm like this, you keep you much past 12, and pretty soon everybody starts taking their Sunday afternoon naps in church. So I want to be ever aware of that. But I just couldn't help but wonder if sometimes when I was reading this passage this week, and the last several weeks really, if Paul had ever felt that way, and if you have ever felt that way. Have you ever felt gloom, despair, and agony? Have you ever felt like the storm is raging all around you? Maybe like you were going down for the third time. Like if it weren't for bad luck, you'd have no luck at all. Then say hallelujah. Hallelujah. You know why? Because as a child of God, you don't need luck. You have Jesus. Okay? You have Jesus. Because when the storms rage, it's then that the Lord will show himself to you in a very real and powerful way, in a supernatural way. It is during the midst of the storm. It is never in the quietness of the valley, but always in the midst of the storm that God's people cry out, "My Lord and my God." Last week we talked about storms, and we might think that someone like the Apostle Paul and the writer of the Gospel of Luke and the writer of Acts, Dr. Luke, we might think that they don't know what trouble's like, okay? That they couldn't understand how you and I feel in the midst of the storms we face today. But that would not be true. To begin with, as we begin in verse 20 in the 27th chapter of Acts, Luke writes, "For many days neither sun nor stars appeared." If you don't see the sun in the daytime, why? Clouds. Dark clouds. You don't see the stars at night, why? Dark clouds. For many days neither sun nor stars appeared, and the severe storm kept raging. Finally, all hope that we would be saved was disappearing. Now, if you are out in the middle of the ocean and you haven't seen sun nor stars in many days, when it says all hope that you would be saved was disappearing, what is on your mind? Death, right? In other words, what he's saying, we could paraphrase this and simply say, and we thought we were going to die here. Yes. He says in verse 21, "Since many were going without food, Paul stood up among them and said, 'You men should have followed my advice not to sail from Crete and sustain this damage and loss.'" So Paul, here we have a biblical, for all you parents, we have the biblical precedent of "I told you so." Okay? I'm not sure that was much comfort to them at the time, though, that Paul said, "See, I told you we shouldn't have done this." Verse 22, he says, "Now I urge you to take courage, because there will be no loss of any of you, but only of the ship." In 2 Corinthians 1:8, Paul wrote, "For we don't want you to be unaware, brothers, of our affliction that took place in the province of Asia. We were completely overwhelmed, beyond our strength, so that we even despaired of life." So here we have two written accounts where Paul was like, basically we think we're going to die. This is how bad things were. This was the storm Paul was in. We don't like to admit it as God's people, but we have probably all had those moments in our lives when we had just said, "Lord, I just want to die." Because things get so bad. The title of the message this morning is "The Anchors Hold." Paul was in a stormy place. He was in a rough place. Here's what's amazing. We've read, this is the end of the book of Acts. Okay, we've only got one more chapter to go. We've heard how Paul, right, beaten up, left for dead, thrown in prison, arrested, snuck over the walls, beaten up again. People followed him to get beaten up. And this is the first time we read, and we think we're going to die. You'd think that after everything Paul had been through, he would be like, this is no big deal. Been there, done that before. Maybe it was all his time he'd spent in prison recently. Maybe it was his lack of, rich fellowship with other believers. He didn't get to fellowship as well as he did when he was a free man. Maybe he was his age. Maybe he was tired. But this is the first time we begin to see desperation creep into the Apostle Paul. And I'll tell you this morning, there will be a time in the life of most Christians that you will come upon a real storm. And how you handle that storm will determine a great deal as to how you live the remainder of your Christian life. Because we are living in a day and a time when Christianity is not growing in our country. I just read of an individual in Arizona who had 20 people over to his house for a Bible study and is now going to have to serve 60 days in jail for that. They said he violated zoning laws. He's got like 1.5 acres of property. And they actually even told him if you just had a barbecue, it'd be okay. But you can't have a Bible study with that many people. We live in a day when the storm clouds of persecution are on the horizon in our country. What will we do when they arrive? What will we do when the dark clouds become a full-fledged fury in this country? See, the reason so many of us get derailed when the storms hit, and why I believe so many of God's people will actually deny the Lord at first when persecution comes, is because we have no plan for our Christian life. We plan for vacations. We plan for weddings. We plan for graduations. We plan for retirement. But we have no plan in our lives for Christ. And our lives must be rooted and grounded in Christ. We need to be anchored. That way when the storms come, regardless of what types they are or how severe, when our friends and our relatives and our church look to us as we ride out the storm, we can cry out, I will be okay, because the anchors hold. So this morning, in the remainder of the 27th chapter of the book of Acts, I want us to look at 4 anchors I see in this passage. 4 anchors we need to have in order to endure, ride out, and have victory over the storms in our lives. Anchor 1 is really simple. God. Verse 23 and 24. Paul says, for this night, an angel of the God I belong to and serve stood by me. This is kind of the amazing thing. I want to pause there real quick just for a moment, because Paul was with that group. Luke was saying we were in desperation. We despaired for our lives, even though Paul had the assurance from God. So this is how bad it was. There was still that hint of desperation in the midst of the assurance. For this an angel of the God I belong to and serve stood by me, saying, don't be afraid, Paul. You must stand before Caesar, and look, God has graciously given you all those you are sailing with, or who are sailing with you. Man, I thought about that just for a minute. This doesn't have anything to do with the anchors. There's just a couple thoughts that came to me as I kind of finished out this outline. Talk about being in good company. You know that if the Apostle Paul had not been on that ship, those sailors would have probably all died. I love that. He said, God has graciously given you all those who are sailing with you. Brothers and sisters, we need to live our lives in such a way that we can be confident that the lost that are in our lives, that God will give them to us. I pray that God could say that about us. But the anchor one, the first anchor we must have in our life is we must be anchored to God. The person of God. The omnipotent one. Did we realize, and I know as I look out amongst you, I could say that everybody here that I know would nod, in agreement with this. But do we realize that everything is held together by God? And that nothing happens that catches God by surprise? See, there's some real, there's real assurance in that. There's confidence in that. There is a peace that comes from knowing that the world's not random and spinning out of control, even though it looks that way. That we serve the God of the universe, the self-existing one, the holy God, the omnipresent God, the omniscient God, the sovereign God. Think about that this morning. I don't know what you're all going through, but to the Garbarino family, God's got it all under control. Remember that song? You ever remember that song? I don't know if you used to sing it. We used to sing it when we were kids. He's got the whole world in his hand. He's got the Garbarino family in his hands. He's got Ed Garbarino in his hands. If the Simmons family were here this morning, I'd say it's okay because he's got Ed Simmons wrapped in his embrace. To the Johnson family, I'd say he's got the Johnson family in his hands. To the Sawaya family, he's got you in his hands. To the Lloyd family, we're praying he moves his hands here, okay? Because he's got you in his hands. But the problem is, you say, well, I believe in God, and I trust God, but the problem is our anchor is still a little, it doesn't go very deep. Because when the anchor that Paul was talking about with God had to do with belonging to and serving. Again in verse 23, he says, for this night an angel of the God I belong to and serve. Paul is stating simply this, that God owns him, and I will declare before you this morning that you won't fully serve him until he owns you. See, a lot of people tell me, well, I possess salvation. But I want to ask you, does Jesus possess you? Does God own you this morning? Do you know who you are and whose you are? John 1:12. But to all who did receive him, Jesus, he gave them the right to be children of God, to those who believe in his name. Do we grasp the depth of the fact that we are children of God? 1 John 3:2. John writes, dear friends, we are God's children now. Right now. You don't have to wait to be God's children. The minute you become born again, you are adopted into God's family and you become one of God's children. Then he says, and what we will be has not yet been revealed. In other words, as good as it is being God's kid now, it's going to get better. We know that when he appears, we will be like him because we will see him as he is. This morning, for the anchor to hold firm and fast, we need to know who we belong to and whose we are and live a life of faith accordingly. Yesterday I went to Walmart. I had to get some things and Dina was with me. And on the way home, these people, they walked in front of us. Okay? And all I noticed was there was a woman that walked in front of us. And on the way home, Dina was commenting about how she was dressed or how she wasn't dressed, might be a better